biblical narrative prose is very swift, very compact. It's elegant, but somehow simple, almost homey, and not particularly modern. I want to underline that. That is, the various translations of the Bible that were done after the Second World War, roughly in the second half of the 20th century, including the new Jewish Publication Society translation that you probably are all familiar with, tried to make the Bible comprehensible by updating the language, by using a vocabulary that you might find in Time magazine or the Washington Post or whatever. For example, in the JPS translation, Joseph distributes rations in Egypt, which is all wrong. You know, only people with tin ear would do something like that because the concept was alien to the ancient Near East. So, to begin with, I strive for a language that is readable as literary English, and yet has a slightly antique coloration. It doesn't sound like something that was written just yesterday. There is also, okay, that's as far as the narrative prose goes. Then there's the issue of dialogue. Dialogue is, I would say, the major vehicle for narrating in the Bible. When something important happens, I would say 4 times out of 5, it transpires through dialogue. And I've come to see over the years that the biblical writers were really the first inventors of something like novelistic dialogue. That is, dialogue where there is a give and take between the two speakers in the exchange, and where the characters define themselves by the way they talk, the kind of words they use, and how they respond to each other. You could compare this just briefly to dialogue in Homer, which is wonderful, it's eloquent, but it's not really dialogue. That is, there isn't this same kind of give and take. A Homeric hero in the Iliad will begin speaking eloquently and go on eloquently for 300 lines, which is not what happens in the Bible. So something of the liveliness of the give and take of biblical narrative, biblical dialogue, I think is very important to strive to convey when you're transposing it into English. Then there is the matter of precision of word choice. Now, I want to remind everybody that compared to the sort of fiction that we're accustomed to reading, that is typically the novel, the biblical narrative is very sparing, very economical. That is, a story that would be told in 100,000 words in a novel can be told in 1,000 words in biblical narrative. I'm convinced that there was a conventional agreement between the storyteller and his audience in the biblical period that the vocabulary was to be limited, that only certain words could be used in narrative, and other words were reserved for poetry, which I could explain more later. What this means, few words and a limited vocabulary, is that each individual word choice has a high level of salience. It sticks out. It bears a certain freight of meaning. And if you don't get it right, you're really messing up the story. I'll give you 2 examples. The first one is from 2 Samuel chapter 3, I believe. There's a civil war between the house of Saul, Saul's already dead, and the house of David. And Saul's savvy general, Abner, is being pursued by a hot-headed young man named Asael, who we are told was as fleet as one of the deers of the field. He was sort of the Usain Bolt of the biblical period. And he's the brother of the commander, Joab, of David's forces. So Abner sees him running after him, and he says, turn to the right or to the left and strike down one of the lads and take his khalifa. That's with a fe, with an F sound. And so what is a khalifa? By the way, what happens in the story is Asael won't be deterred. He keeps pursuing Abner. So Abner, as an experienced warrior, stops short, thrusts his spear under his arm backwards into the soft belly of Asael and kills him. So he didn't listen to Abner. But what is this khalifa that he's saying he should take? The word appears, I'm sorry, I have to correct myself. The word is chalitza, with a tzadi, a tz sound. Now, chalitza as an item that you wear appears only in one other place in the Bible. Well, the place that it appears is in the Samson story. In the Samson story, Samson bets the 30 companions at his Philistine wedding that if they solve the riddle, he'll give each one of them a sheet of fine fabric and a chalifat bigadim, a change of clothing, a suit. In modern Hebrew, chalifa is a suit. But then when he goes down, when he realizes that his wife has told them what the riddle is, infuriated, he goes to Gaza, he kills 30 Philistines, and he doesn't bring back chalifot with a fe, he brings back this other word, chalitzot, with a tzadi. Well, all the modern translations think, okay, it must be a synonym for change of garment. So, for example, the new JPS, getting it seriously wrong, says in the Abner Asael story, strike down one of the lads and take his tunic, chalitzato. Well, I stopped short and I thought about this. I said, wait a minute. What does a warrior do when he kills an enemy warrior on the field of battle? We know from Homer, and these are related cultures. He doesn't take his tunic, he takes his armor. And then I thought about the etymology of the word. In biblical Hebrew, chalutz doesn't mean pioneer as in modern Hebrew. It means the vanguard of the army, the guys who fight in front of the main body of troops. So a chalitza is something that a fighter, one of the elite fighters in the vanguard would wear, which is armor. And then I thought back to the Samson story, and I said, oh, this is really brilliant. What goes on there is the following. The bet was for 30 changes of garments. The infuriated Samson says to himself, I'll show these guys. And he goes down to Gaza. He doesn't kill 30 ordinary Philistines. He kills 30 warriors. And he sends back to the 30 companions at the wedding, not 30 changes of garment, but 30 pieces of armor, which are far more valuable than changes of clothing. So you see, it's his way of sticking it to the Philistines. So in both these stories, if you miss what the precise meaning of the word is, you miss what's really going on in the story. Okay, a second example, which involves maybe nuance rather than missing the point. In the story told in 2 Samuel 13 of the rape of Tamar by her half-brother Amnon, he pretends to be ill, and he sends word that he wants Tamar brought to him and give him this food to eat, a food called levivot, which in modern Hebrew is pancakes, but God knows what it was, but it's something you make in a pan. But in the course of this story, while he's pretending to be very sick, the word for food that is repeatedly used and hardly occurs anywhere else is birya. And the cognate verb lahavrot evidently means to feed. When I looked at this as a translator, it occurred to me, well, there are a couple of other good Hebrew words for food. Why in this story, in contrast to other stories, was this word birya and the related verb used? So then I checked all the occurrences in the concordance of this particular verbal root. Birya is always food that you give to somebody who has either been fasting or is ill and feeling poorly. Okay? So, and that makes sense etymologically because bari, which is related to this, means healthy or fat. You know, they didn't distinguish between those things. And the opposite of fat is dal, or healthy is dal, which is poorly. So birya is food that you give to somebody to sustain that person when he's in a bad way. So it seemed to me inadequate simply to translate it as food, the way everybody does. So it's something like ancient Near Eastern chicken soup. But it couldn't have been chicken soup because they hadn't yet domesticated the chicken. So I translated it as nourishment. So you see what I mean about the importance of word choice. Okay, I would now like to get on by saying some words about this group of books that I've just translated, what their distinctive nature is. Now, to begin with, there's the problem of the name of these books. When I spoke to my editor a few years ago at Norton and said, well, the next thing I want to do is the former prophets, he said, the what? And then it suddenly dawned on me that most people don't recognize this as a label for a group of books in the Bible, and then they might ask the question, former prophets? Former to what? Or what did they do after they stopped being prophets? Of course, this is a literal and conventionally accepted translation of the Hebrew label Nevi'im Rishonim. And they're former because then they were the prophets proper, that is Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the minor prophets. And it's true that some prophetic figures do appear in these stories, but that's not really what they're primarily about. So it's a slightly misleading, if traditional, label. Now, the texts themselves are highly variegated, and I'll just rattle off the variegation very quickly. We have Joshua, a schematic and probably fantasized narrative of history. Why do I say fantasized? Well, it's a good thing that it's fantasized because the first half of the book of Joshua is largely devoted to a genocidal blitzkrieg against Canaan, in which city after city is wiped out, man, woman, and child. Fortunately, the archaeological evidence indicates that this never happened. As, by the way, the most memorable story that everybody recalls from Joshua, the walls of Jericho. Alas, in the late 13th century BCE, which would have been Joshua's period, Jericho had no walls. It was a small it had previously been a walled city, and by that period it was kind of a small town without any kind of fortification or walls. So I'll come back in a minute to why I think that this peculiar, grim fantasy of genocide occupies Joshua. And then the second half of Joshua is about the apportioning of the land to the various tribes, so not very exciting stuff. Then we have the book of Judges, which is a medley of folk tales about military heroes. A judge really is a kind of chieftain. Some of these may have historical kernels, others may not. Then we have the book of Samuel, which is divided for technical reasons only into 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. And here, after the arc narrative in the first few chapters, we have what I suspect is a series of stories based on actual historical events. And then finally, the last of these units are the two Book of Kings, which originally, like Samuel, was one book. If you want to know how we got 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, the scrolls were too long. No, that's simply a fact. They couldn't get it all on one scroll, so they divided it up. And when they did the Greek translation of the Bible in the 3rd century BCE, they named it 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. But the Talmud only speaks of Sefer Shmuel, the book of Samuel. So the Book of Kings is itself highly heterogeneous. That is, you have the account of Solomon's building of the temple, the furnishings of the temple, and the furnishings of his palace. You have folk tales such as Solomon's judgment, which you're all familiar with. Certainly the miraculous stories about the prophets Elijah and Elisha have a folkloric character. But then we have straight historical reportage, some of it about the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel. Some of this confirmed, say, by Assyrian inscriptions and other extra-biblical sources. So it's a kind of hodgepodge. And it's all put together by... there is a scholarly label for these books, which is very hard to pronounce. It's called the Deuteronomistic History. Now, why do they call it that? Because scholars with very few dissents long ago came to the conclusion that a group of writers or writers/editors associated with the School of Deuteronomy, which would have been first active around the year 621 BCE, put together these books. When I say put together, I don't mean exactly that they wrote it. They had some very old stories. Then they drew on annals from the court of Judah and the court of Israel. Sometimes you find at the end of the report of a particular king, and the rest of the deeds of King Hezekiah, are they not written in the book of the Acts of the Kings of Judah? So that would have been a source which they took from selectively. Now, the Deuteronomists had an agenda. The agenda, part of the agenda had to do with a total separation of the Israelite population from the Canaanite population. You're not supposed to intermarry with them. You're not supposed to adopt their social practices. You're not supposed to, God forbid, adopt their cultic practices. In fact, this was happening all the time. And I think, by the way, that's why we have the tale of genocide in Joshua. It's a sort of fantasy of absolute separation where almost the entire Canaanite population is wiped out. So there's nobody left to intermingle with, except here and here, there, a little notation. Such and such Canaanite people could not be entirely subdued, so they became forced labor for the Israelites until this day. We had that formula a few times. Now, I want to get on from these brief introductory remarks to the more compelling issue for me of translation, but let me just offer one small illustration of a tension between the Deuteronomistic editor and the older materials that he put together, which he evidently felt he could not mess with very seriously. They were already almost canonical. When David is on his deathbed, some of you may remember this, he summons Solomon and gives him a kind of oral will. So the first thing he says is, I am going in the way of all the earth, and you must be strong and be a man. Okay, that sounds very plausible. And then he says, and you must walk in the ways of the Lord and love him with all your heart and with all your might and do all his commandments so that your days be lengthened, and on and on. Now, even from my rapid paraphrase summary, you hear a lot of familiar phrases. And they all come from the book of Deuteronomy. They're recurrent, stereotypical phrases from Deuteronomy. What are they doing there? Nobody in the book of Samuel, least of all David, ever speaks like this. Well, you have to look to the second half of David's speech. He says, you were a wise man, Solomon. Okay, we all know about Solomon's fabled wisdom. He says, you will know what to do. And then he gives him a hit list. He mentions enemies he couldn't get rid of, and he wants Solomon to use his wisdom to finish off these guys. So it's kind of like the last scene in Godfather 1. And I believe that the Deuteronomistic editor, working probably at least 3 centuries after the original story was composed, squirmed at this appearance of David as a kind of capo di mafia. So he tried to counterbalance it by introducing 4 or 5 sentences of Deuteronomistic piety, which he put in David's mouth, and then he went on to quote what David actually said from the old source he was using. So you see what I mean about a tension between the editor and the variegated materials he drew on. Okay, I would now like to get on to some examples of what one does with translation. Okay, first, dialogue. I want to read a piece from the Samson story, which we've already gotten onto. And it happened when they saw him, this is at the wedding, that they took 30 companions to be with him. And Samson said to them, Let me pose you a riddle. If you actually explain it to me during the 7 days of the feast and find the solution, I shall give you 30 fine cloths and 30 changes of garments. This is where it's chalifot with a fe. And if you are not able to explain it to me, you shall give me 30 fine cloths and 30 changes of garment. And they said to him, pose your riddle that we may hear it. And he said to him, and this is a line of poetry, and in many traditional societies, riddling is a game where you pose the riddle in a line of verse and answer in a line of verse. From the eater, food came forth, and from the strong, sweet came forth. This is, of course, an unfair riddle, because it has to do with the lion and the honeycomb. And no one could have known this except Samson, who found the honeycomb in the lion's carcass. And they could not explain the riddle for 3 days. And it happened on the 4th day that they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband that he explain the riddle, or we will burn you and your father's house in fire. Did the two of you call us here to beggar us? Now here, I hope you can hear some of the sharpness of biblical dialogue. What do you think you're doing here? Did you call us here? Did you invite us to the wedding to beggar us? And Samson's wife wept before him and said, you only hate me and don't love me. You posed a riddle to my countrymen, but to me you did not explain it. This is the coaxing and cajoling wife, which again, I think you can hear in the language of the dialogue. And she wept before him the 7 days that they had the feast. And it happened on the 7th day that he explained it to her, for she had badgered him. And she explained the riddle to her countrymen. And the townsmen said to him on the 7th day, before the sun went down, they wait to the last minute, the way Phineas Fogg in 80 Days Around the World comes into the club in London just before the 80th, the clock strikes the end of the 80th day, and they answer the riddle in a line of poetry. What is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion? And he said to them, had you not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. And that's also a line of poetry, and obviously the intention is sexual. Had you not messed around with my wife, you wouldn't have found out what the solution to the riddle was. Okay, and at that point he rushes down to Gaza and does all that I just told you a few minutes ago. Okay, one other example of dialogue from 1 Samuel chapter 20. Now, this is at the point in the story when Saul has become completely estranged from David and wants to kill him. And Jonathan, Saul's son and heir apparent, of course, is a bosom buddy of David. And David is in hiding, and they have a feast for the new moon, and Jonathan and David speak to each other out in the field. Now, by the way, in biblical times, the new moon, Rosh Chodesh, was a really big deal. You didn't do any work, you offered sacrifice, and there was a grand festive meal. So that's the real life reference in this story. And Jonathan said to David, witness the Lord God of Israel that I will sound out my father at this hour tomorrow or the day after, and whether he is well disposed to David or not, I will send to you and reveal to you. Thus may the Lord do to Jonathan and even more. If it seems good to my father to bring the evil upon you, I will reveal it to you, and I will send you off and you shall go safely, and the Lord shall be with you as he was with my father. Would that while I am still alive you may keep the Lord's faith with me, that I not die, and that you do not cut off your faithfulness from my house for all time, not even when the Lord cuts off all David's enemies from the face of the earth. So they seal a pact, and I think I'm going to skip down here they're now assembled at the table. And the king sat in his place as he was wont to do, as in the seat by the wall, and Jonathan preceded him, and Abner sat by Saul's side, and David's place was vacant. And Saul spoke no word on that day, for he thought, it is a mischance, he is unclean and has not been cleansed. But the mischance, probably, it's a biblical word that could refer to nocturnal emission of semen, in which case you're not in a state of ritual purity to offer the sacrifice, and you wouldn't be able to come to this festive meal. And it happened on the day after the new moon, the second day, that David's place was still vacant. And Saul said to Jonathan his son, why has not the son of Jesse come to the feast either yesterday or today? But the son of Jesse, without saying David, is a slightly insulting form of reference in biblical speech. It's like calling somebody Rabinowitz rather than Sam or Sam Rabinowitz. So why has the son of Jesse not come to the feast today? And Jonathan said to Saul, David has urgently asked of me to go to Bethlehem. And he said to me, let me go pray, for we have a clan sacrifice in the town, and my brother has commanded me to it. And so, if I have found favor in your eyes, let me pray, go away, that I may see my brothers. Therefore has he not come to the king's table. And Saul was incensed with Jonathan, and he said to them, O son of a perverse, wayward woman, don't I know you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, you and your kingship will not be unshaken. And now, send and fetch him to me, for he is a dead man. Now, you can hear the brutality of Saul's speech, I hope, in the language, for he is a dead man. And the father becomes so infuriated with the son that he curses him in the name of his mother, who is Saul's wife, of course, which is something you do particularly in Semitic languages and maybe and in other languages as well, as we know, being speakers of English. And the shame of your mother's nakedness is not an obscenity, but it gets to be rather close to a certain familiar obscenity that we have in modern Arabic and modern Hebrew with an approximate equivalent in English. So you can see how this dialogue is exploding with energy, which is something that I strive to get at in my translation. Okay, I want to do maybe three more fairly brief examples. First, here's something that's going to sound a little strange to you because it's a translation issue that will not be visible to most readers, but it was rather important to me as a translator. Biblical Hebrew makes very important use of rhythms. I find that virtually all the modern translations in English are arrhythmic, and this kills the original. So I'm going to give you an extreme example. When David has Uriah murdered after having slept with Uriah's wife Bathsheba. The prophet Nathan comes to rebuke David. And you may all remember that he begins his rebuke by telling him a parable, the parable of the poor man's ewe, E-W-E, that is a female lamb. Now, in the Hebrew, there are two stylistic features to this parable which tell you that it's a parable and not like the surrounding narrative. First, certain items of vocabulary appear here that appear nowhere else. For example, oreach, the word for wayfarer, rash, the word for poor man, don't appear elsewhere. And I couldn't entirely do this because there wasn't a good English equivalent. The second thing is the rhythm. The rhythm is a deliberately sing-song rhythm. That is, I'll just recite the first few words in Hebrew. Shnei anashim hayu be'ir echat, echad ashir v'echad rash. You see what I mean by the sing-song. So I try to get at that in the English. And the Lord sent Nathan to David, and he came to him and said to him, 2 men there were in a single town. One was rich and the other poor, which is a not bad approximation of the Hebrew cadence. The rich man had sheep and cattle in great abundance, and the poor man had nothing save one little ewe that he had bought. And he nurtured her and raised her with him together with his sons. From his crust she would eat, and from his cup she would drink, and in his lap she would lie, and she was to him like a daughter. And a wayfarer came to the rich man, and it seemed a pity to him to take from his own sheep and cattle to prepare for the traveler who had come to him. And he took the poor man's ewe and prepared it for him for the man who had come to him. And David's anger flared hot against the man, and he said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, doomed is the man who has done this. And the poor man's ewe he shall pay back fourfold, inasmuch he has done this thing, and because he had no pity." And Nathan said to David, "You are the man." So the parable functions quite like the play within the play in Hamlet. You remember Hamlet says, "The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king." So here it's the parable that catches the conscience of the king. Now, I want to comment on one line. Some of you may think this is bizarre. Often when you translate, you're slightly frustrated because you know the solution you've come up with is not a perfect solution, but you couldn't think of anything else. Every once in a while, you nail it, and it gives you a good feeling around the heart. So here, this line, from his crust she would eat, and from his cup she would drink, and in his lap she would lie, which in the Hebrew is mipito tochal umikoso tishte uvecheko tishkav. So you can hear the similarity of the rhythms, and I was particularly happy that I could, each of those 3 nouns in the Hebrew, if you discount the possessive suffix, is a monosyllable. It's pat for crust, kos for cup, and chek for lap. And I was very happy when I found 3 perfect monosyllables in English as equivalent. And then I looked at the King James Version after I'd done my draft, and I saw in his bosom she would lie. And I said, oh, they almost had it, but they ruined it by saying bosom instead of lap. Okay, yeah. I'd like to conclude with one instance of poetry. So I'm going back to the book of Judges. Okay, this is a song of Deborah. Now, I mentioned that various materials were put together by the editor of the former prophets from different periods. And this is probably the oldest text, not only in the prophets, but very possibly in the Hebrew Bible. This is a Song of Deborah. In general, poetry is earlier than prose, and the language of the poem is often very archaic. For that reason, sometimes we're not sure what all the words mean, I have to say in full honesty. And maybe at a few points the scribes, the ancient scribes, didn't know what those very archaic words meant, and they scrambled them a little bit. So there are difficulties. But one way you can see the archaic nature of the poem is the use of incremental repetition. Now that sounds very fancy, but it's a simple concept. Something is repeated verbatim, like I'll make up an example. And the knight went down to the sea. And the knight went down to the sea on a white stallion. So the repetition is on the knight went down to the sea, and then the increment, what's added to the repetition, is on a white stallion. Well, this is a very old device in folk tales and in poetry, and it's characteristic of the oldest layer of biblical poetry, and is not much used in later biblical poetry. And it's all over the place in the Song of Deborah, which may well have been written shortly after the military triumph it records, which would put it back around the year 1100 BCE. In other words, 3.5 centuries earlier than Homer. What I want to do is read the last segment of the poem, which is the story of Yael and Sisera. But I want to read maybe 4 or 5 lines that lead up to it. From the heavens the stars did battle. From their course they did battle with Sisera. The Kishon Wadi swept them off. An ancient wadi, the Kishon Wadi. March on, my being in valor. The hooves of the horses hammered from the gallop of his steeds. Curse Meroz, said the Lord's messenger, curse, O curse its dwellers, for they did not come to the aid of the Lord, midst the warriors. That is, this is a period where there's no unity among the tribes, and certain towns and certain tribes did not commit themselves to the military effort, and they're roundly abused here. And that line from the hooves of the horses hammered for the gallop of his steeds tries to emulate the Hebrew onomatopoeia, which is Halmu ikvot susav midarot daharot abirav. So you can hear that. Now, here's my last illustration, with which I'll conclude. Blessed above women Yael, wife of Hever the Kenite. Above women in tents be she blessed. This is incremental repetition. Blessed among women in tents be she blessed. Water he asked for, milk did she give. In a princely bowl she served him curds. Her hand for the tent peg reached out, and her right hand for the workman's hammer. And she hammered Sisera, cracked his head. She smashed and pierced his temple. Between her legs he kneeled, fell, lay. Between her legs he kneeled, he fell. Where he kneeled, he fell, destroyed. Through the window she looked out, moaned, Sisera's mother through the lattice. Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why so late the clatter of his cars? The wisest of her ladies answer her. She too replies on her own. Why, they will find and share out the spoils, a damsel or two for every man. Spoil of dyed stuff for Sisera, spoil of dyed stuff, dyed needlework pairs for every neck. That's the end of the words of the women in the Canaanite court. And then the end of the poem. Thus perish all your enemies, O Lord, and be his friends like the sun coming out in its might. Well, this is very fierce stuff. It goes back to the most archaic period of ancient Israelite history, and it's very much the expression of a fierce warrior culture, so that Rembrandt's painting of the gouging out of the eyes of Samson on the jacket of my book, I thought was particularly appropriate to illustrate this whole series of stories. But there is a kind of grandeur, a musical power, and an epic distance in the language of the poem. And of course, you can never get anything 100% perfect. You have to try to get a good approximation, which is what I have done in translating the poem and what I did also, or attempted to do, with the dialogue and with the narration. Now, orality and Everett Fox. Okay, remember this is a manuscript culture. We have no clear sense how widespread literacy was, but in any case, a parchment scroll would have been a very valuable object. And the average man and woman in the street in Jerusalem in the 7th century BCE couldn't afford his or her own copy, right? Even if they were literate. So the way the biblical texts were delivered to their audiences is that somebody read them out from a scroll to an audience. So rhythms are important, repetitions of words. In all this, I'm in total agreement with Everett Fox. But I have to say where we part company. That is, I admire Fox's endeavor to convey the Hebrewness of the Hebrew in the English. But the question is, how do you go about doing this? His guide, of course, was the German translation done by Buber and Rosenzweig beginning in the 1920s and finished by Buber by himself long after Rosenzweig's early death. And that would have been in, I think, the early 1950s, the whole thing was finished. It's a weird German, and Fox's English is an even weirder English. Well, what's wrong with that? I'll give you a couple of examples. The problem is, as far as we can judge, the biblical writers had perfect pitch in the idiomatic control of their own language. So if you convey this in an English which is often weird, I think that you're distorting the original. Two examples. A perfectly ordinary word, mizbeach, means altar, A-L-T-A-R, right? Fox translates this as slaughter site. Now, the reason he does this is because you see the Hebrew root zavoach, to slaughter or to sacrifice, inscribed in the noun mizbeach. The problem is this. Mizbeach is a very ordinary Hebrew word. Slaughter site is not an English word at all. It kind of stops you cold. In addition, I'm not sure that the ancient speaker of Hebrew thought of slaughter every time he saw the word Mizbeach. For example, there is stipulated in Exodus something called the Mizbach HaNechoshet, the copper altar, which is a small thing on which incense is offered and nothing else. No slaughter is associated with it. So would you call that a slaughter sign? Okay, so that's one. Then Fox does things like here's the problem. When you translate, let me say this. You always have to make a decision. You're always sacrificing something. So what is more important and what can you afford to sacrifice? So in the Ten Commandments, Fox translates, you shall not adulter, which I find as a fairly literate speaker of English is comical, because there is no English word adulter. Why did he do that? Because he wanted the rhythm. That is the rhythm. The Hebrew is very concise. It's lo tin af. So he figured that adulter was a lot closer to the Hebrew rhythmically than commit adultery. I admit commit adultery is a mouthful in English, but it's the only way to say it in authentic English. And I don't think, in my deep conviction, is you cannot translate the Bible into weird English. I like the King James Version a lot better than all the other modern translations. It tries to be fairly literal, even to the point of literally translating Hebrew idioms, which were not English idioms, but became English idioms because of the King James Bible. For example, find favor in your eyes, which was not English, but it became English. And by the way, find favor in your eyes, a small illustration of some continuity between biblical and modern Hebrew, is perfectly colloquial contemporary Hebrew. That is, one Israeli could say to that, does it find favor in your eyes? That sounds weird. It simply ways do you like it? The King James Version is on the whole fairly literal, which I admire. It has usually a great sense of English style, which you cannot say of the 20th century English translations of the Bible. Those people have tin ears. There are lapses, more lapses than people remember in the King James Version, especially in poetry. That is, some lines of poetry are absolutely great, and then they'll use 16 words for 3 or 4 in the Hebrew, which I find ghastly and unacceptable, since part of the beauty of ancient Hebrew poetry is its compactness. Now, there are a couple of problems with the King James Bible. One, of course, is it's not its fault that is 400 years have passed, the language has changed a lot, and we don't always understand what those words mean anymore. Some of the language was even deliberately a little archaic in its time. Then there are a lot of errors because biblical Hebrew was not understood nearly as well in Christian Hebraist circles in the early 17th century as we understand it today, or indeed as the great medieval Hebrew scholars understood it. I'll give you 2 examples. In the solemn covenant between Abraham and God in Genesis 15, Abraham falls on his face and it's dusk and there's this brazier burning, and the King James Version says, and lo, a great dread of darkness fell upon him. Now, actually what the Hebrew says is a great dark dread fell upon him. And chashecha can either be a noun meaning darkness, but here it's not. It's also a feminine adjective meaning dark. And they just got the syntax wrong, making Abraham, our forefather, afraid of the dark, which I doubt he was. Okay, now the second example, in the Death Wish poem, there's a line in the King James Version that reads like this: "For those who rouse their mourning," mourning. Now, there's no mourning at all in the Hebrew. What the Hebrew says is, "For those who rouse Leviathan." So how did mourning get in there? They really messed up on this. The Hebrew for Leviathan is Livyatan. The Livyatan is a homonym of a word that means their funeral. But actually, it doesn't mean funeral in biblical Hebrew. It's a rabbinic term. And they knew some rabbinic Hebrew as well. So they confused one word for another entirely and got this mythical beast entirely out of Job's Death Wish poem, where it's important for him to be. So there are really howlers like that in the King James Version, and then many smaller errors. Sometime, maybe about 15 years into my career, I owed an article to a magazine, and I thought, I have some ideas now about biblical narrative. I'll write this one article on why you need a literary perspective on biblical narrative. So I wrote the article as a kind of little adventure, and I got this terrific response. So I said, gee, I'm onto something. Maybe I'll write a second article on biblical narrative, which I did. And before long, I've done a little less than 2/3 of the whole Bible, and I guess I'm continuing.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.